why don't we move to mom? But what I also want to interject here, if all of you guys would talk about this, Kurt and Rob, what other measurements that you've seen and that people use, successful, unsuccessful, and all that kind of stuff. And then from Miles' perspective, what he actually sees tried.
All right, so the MUM, that's the acronym for the multi-attribute utility model. It's actually a technique that was developed for non-valuation purposes. It's a decision-making matrix on how to do like geopolitical and where to put nuclear dump sites and things like this, very unusual things like that. And so in the MUM, what you do, it's basically, it's an objective method of interpreting subjective information in theory. And so what you're doing is you're trying to attribute attributes to personal goodwill and attributes to enterprise goodwill. In fact, hang on, I don't know why this is not showing completely. Hey, let me, okay, yeah, there we go. And so you have these different personal goodwill attributes. And if you're talking about personal enterprise goodwill, this is a good list to go through. Like personal is ability, skill, and judgment, age, personal staff, lacks transferability, knowledge of end user. Enterprise goodwill is business names, marketing and branding. That would be branding, like business location, like Gun Barrel Road, years in business, systems, and that sort of thing. So these are the things that are enterprise goodwill. And what this grid does is you have what's called an importance utility and an existence utility. And in importance, you rank these things as how important they are to the profitability of the business, how important they are in this particular business. Now, the way it was originally written, it's on a scale of 1 to 5. And so I've done that, but I usually use a scale of 1 to 10. I think it gives me a little more flexibility. The math's still the same. It just gives you a little more range. So you rank the importance of it regardless of if it's there or not. Then you move over to the existence and you say, okay, well, this particular attribute, maybe it's a 5 out of 5. That's really important. Inbound referrals. It's important to this kind of business, but it's not in existence very much. And so you give it in this case, between 1 and 5. It's very important, but it doesn't exist very much. Okay, it's got a 2. And so you just multiply 1 times the other, and the multiplicative part of it gives it a 10. And then it's just simple math. That 10 out of a total of 214 is 4.7%. So that's just a fairly, I mean, is it subjective? Yeah, sure, there's some of that in there, but you rank them, and you do this with if you get the opportunity to interview the individual, the practitioner, then you would interview them and go down, and you don't want to set them up with what you're doing. What you want to do is try to get honest answers from them. That's been my experience. So in this particular case, it just happens to be that is the attributes, the multiplication turned out that 50% was personal and 50% is enterprise. Then you apply this allocation or deduction, if you will, to the goodwill part of your overall business value. So you say you valued it at $150,000. 50,000 is equipment, 100,000 is goodwill. Then 50%, or you would take a $50,000 allocation out of the personal goodwill. So the total value would be 150 minus 50 equals 100. So the value would be 100. 50% of which is enterprise goodwill, and 50% of which would be the assets or the net assets. So that's how it works.
And, how often do you all use it and see it?
I have used it in court. I've testified several times to it. I've used it in reports that haven't gone to court, and I have testified against other known experts who have used it also. Names that you would know. But I'm just not going to say them now, but names that you would know. And so it does exist.
Yeah. And I was going to say, just along with Rob, in that I have used it quite a bit. When we were talking about this starting, I have not had to testify to it in court, but I've used it a lot. It's just I've used it in cases that have settled, or I've used it several times. And I do a pretty fair amount of collaborative divorce, and I've used it a number of times in that. And so it's worked out well. And even those where in collaborative divorce, and I've got two attorneys that I'm working with both sides, and they're both looking at it and both nodding their heads and going, okay, this makes sense to me. So I've used it. Now, the one other thing I wanted to mention was that, Rhonda, you initially asked what other methods might you use? And one of the reasons I use this is because, to me, and there may even be other ways, but I don't, in my valuation practice, I don't do any fair value work for financial statements, but that's almost the approach that you have to take because you have to identify things like charts, like assembled workforce. What are some of the other components? And then you have to figure out ways to quantify those. Even people that do fair value work, a lot of times will need to do some calculation of the value of a non-compete for one of the owners, and some of those various things. So you almost have to step back and take the approach that you would in a fair value engagement. And to me, trying to quantify each of the individual components is, and I'm not saying I'm taking just the easier way, but I'm taking a little easier way. I'm not identifying specifically the value with each component. I'm just valuing the enterprise and the personal. And it makes a lot more sense to me, and even probably to a judge, to use the MUM analysis as opposed to doing what you would do in a fair value engagement.
Yeah. And and you're right about fair value. I've done several of those you mentioned. And one thing to me that I equate it to is sort of like we have to do on DLOM, where, the Mandelbaum 9 factors. And so, you look at a lot of different things for a DLOM, for example, but then you end up sort of doing this same type thing with all the different characteristics about the company and, less risk, more risk. So, I sort of equate it to that. And to me, it shows a thought process of, again, recognizing it's subjective, but it makes you go through that process of showing those thoughts on paper, as opposed to other methods that might not be as well substantiated. And that's why, that's just my personal opinion. I've got a couple of questions here. One, discuss cross-examination on importance of selection of MUM. I'm not sure, selection of using MUM, maybe. Miles, can you take that?
Yeah, one of the good things, I can't remember which case it was, but Rob and I were working together for the benefit of a client, and the mom came up and opposing, it may have been in a death, opposing health. And the other question, just know that there's not an alternative out there for this type of analysis. But what's important on cross-examination is that you bring that level of gravitas to the table, and the drivers of the business. And I say this over and over and over again in seminars, but when I cross-examine an opposing expert and they cannot answer with clarity, what's the driver of the business? How does the phone ring for new business? It's a real challenge for that expert, because I'm going to drill down. I said, did you even ask management what the driver is? Did you ask my client at his deposition? And most of the time the answer is no, believe it or not. You would, yeah, because they're all worried about all the 500,000 things on your NACFA checklist to do evaluation. Okay. Now I say NACFA just because they've got lots more forms than other people. And so almost what you say isn't as important when you're answering that question as it is that you understand and can speak the language of the judge, which requires the expert. And Rob's super good at this. And watch the judge. What are they doing? And one of my favorite things is when Rob says, "Your Honor seems to have a question." He'll stop talking.
Or if they
Probably-
seem, if they're working on their Christmas list, I'm gonna say, so Your Honor, as you'll see on page 13, you know.
But,
They go,
and they know Rob because he's been in there a bunch, and a young BV ain't gonna say, Judge, it looks like you got a question. So each of those sections requires you to know your topic, but on the other side, know that mom is the only game in town. And so what I would do if I was opposing Rob on that question, I just have my expert read the information about mom and differ with him on the numbers. That's what I would do from an advocacy standpoint. But like I said, the answer itself isn't it nearly as important as the gravitas of the speaker.